This is, of course, the Global Business Report here on Arise News. We're looking at the aviation sector in Nigeria, particularly the sharp rise in prices for flights and also just overall capacity, based, of course, on a new report from Avaero Capital Partners looking at the capacity of the aviation sector and also price increases. Sindy Foster joins us from the UK. She's the principal managing partner at Avaero Capital Partners. Sindy, Happy New Year. Good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Your report did look at a drop in seating capacity in December year on year, about 7% for Nigeria, but we saw a 6% gain for South Africa. What was the primary reason for that drop in seating capacity?
Well, our article was in relation to the OAG Africa market data. So each month, they produce data which gives you certain information about the different countries, different airlines, etc. And one of the things which I noticed was the capacity drop, which they specified. And what they just did was basically showed the number of seats that we had in 2024 and the number of seats that we had in 2025, and that's what the 7 to 8% year-on-year drop was. So it wasn't our study, it was their study. But what we then did was looked at what was the reason why in peak season December capacity shrunk rather than increasing. Because typically in December, we see a lot of wet leased aircraft entering the Nigerian market, celebrated as they enter. And then you still have the busy movement back and forth to different airports. But this year, we saw a lot of busy movement and complaints about flights being cancelled or being delayed or prices being high. So we looked at really what was causing that. And what we found was that, obviously, seats are contained within an aircraft. So if the seats aren't available, it's an indication that the number of aircraft are not available to have the same level of seats that we had previously in December 2024. So that's when we started looking at what was really going on with the aircraft of the airlines.
Great. Now, OAG Africa, I guess, also pointed out that I guess it wasn't an even distribution among airlines, and I guess total capacity, when you include international routes, was down at a smaller margin. Well, what did you make of that?
Well, international is very, very different. Obviously, they're bigger aircraft, and so they already have a lot more seats. And if you recall, last year, in 2024, Air Peace started flying to London, and then in 2025, they added an extra route, Abuja to Heathrow, Abuja to Gatwick. So we've got extra capacity, extra seats in that system, and they were flying daily flights. So one airline flying, twice daily from different airports, that's a lot of capacity to add to the route. So it wasn't so much that lots of Nigerian airlines started to use their domestic aircraft to fly international. That's not what happened, because I remember seeing a comment like that and thinking, but it's not even the same aircraft that does these long international routes. So really what it was that Air Peace have been working on their strategy, flying more international routes, whilst trying to fly their domestic routes as well. So that's really what happened with the OAG difference between the domestic and international.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. Your report still talks about operational constraints that the airlines are facing. Can you flesh that out a little bit for us? What those operational constraints are?
Okay, well, they really sort of fit into two separate buckets. There are global constraints which have been affecting all airlines. Things like aircraft slow delivery. So airlines which have ordered aircraft haven't received the aircraft when they really wanted them. So as we know, Air Peace are owed quite a few aircraft by one of the manufacturers. I'm not going to single out any manufacturer in this conversation, but there are ongoing issues with engines. So engine manufacturers can't provide engines. There's also issues with capacity delays at MROs, and that's partly because if you haven't got your new aircraft, you're having to fly your older aircraft more, which means that you're probably going to have more requirement for maintenance, and the older aircraft require more maintenance, and so we've got these backlogs. That's the global context. And then Nigeria specifically, we had just before Christmas, we had an issue where we had 6 aircraft pulled out of service. Obviously, those aircraft were meant to be operating probably full, flying multiple times a day. But 4 were removed through lessor behavior, and 2 were down because of ground. One was a ground handling incident at the airport, and the other one was a bird strike. So just before Christmas peak period, we lost 6 aircraft. So obviously you can't go to the market and replace an aircraft. Once you're down, you're down. We're not in a system where you can, if you've got an AOG situation, you've got spare capacity that you can just bring in an extra aircraft as and when needed. And so really what happened was the lack of those 6 aircraft heavily impacted well, I'll come on to how it impacted the fares, but it affected the available seats.
Great. Now, it's a big topic, complex. There's a lot of things going on. So we thank you for taking the time to break this down for us. I want to read a couple quotes from your report because, some Nigerians have gotten so frustrated with pricing. They think it's price gouging. So just a couple excerpts here. Reporting from the period, I think it's the December period, indicates that some airlines added limited extra frequencies on select routes while pricing adjusted sharply where aircraft rotations were inefficient, return legs were largely empty, or network imbalance was most acute. And then the excerpt continues to say, in contrast, fares remained more manageable on routes with stronger two-way demand. The result was wide fare divergence across regions, generating public frustration, but reflecting the economics of a supply-constrained network rather than arbitrary pricing decisions. Can you please touch on that?
Yeah, okay. So before I talk about the price, it's important that I talk about the costs. So an airline has fixed costs and it has operating costs. And your costs are typically split amongst your seats. So you get what is called a CASK, so cost per seat. Now, if you've got fewer seats, what that means is that cost is now split through fewer seats. So now if you apply those costs to fewer seats, your fares are likely to go up.
Gotcha.
So that's the mechanism in terms of how pricing is. Nobody just puts a finger in the air and decides, what shall I price? It's based on your costs. You've got to try to cover your costs, both your fixed costs and the costs of operating that route. Now, the reason why you had disparity between some routes was because some routes had solid two-way traffic, that you had lots of frequencies. You could fill your aircraft, go into one destination and coming back, you could come back, full or reasonably full. But in some of the regions, and it's not just in December, it's been a well-known phenomenon that these regional destinations at Christmas, people go to their villages from Lagos or from wherever, and they stay there for a while until they come back at some point in January. And I know some friends come back at the end of January. They have an extended holiday in their village. But the aircraft has to go and come back. It's coming back empty. Who's going to pay for the cost of the aircraft coming back empty? It's still paying the navigation charges, the crew charges, fuel charges, everything else, and you still have to have an apportionment of your costs. So what they do is they take into consideration that it's only going to be one way, and they apply the appropriate fare for that particular route. So that's all that's happening. Nobody's looking at a map and saying XYZ should pay more. It's not. It's really based on just, if you've got a margin that you want to apply, that's what you do. So you're not trying to arbitrarily to do it. It's really based on that. And the biggest issue is the reduction in seats.
Thank you so much. Now, your report says restoring balance requires rebuilding the fundamentals that allow airlines to operate at scale. So what are those fundamentals that will allow airlines to operate at scale?
Okay, before I go into that, I want to make it clear that for this particular report, we're talking about in terms of the operational service, not in terms of size of airline, because that's a slightly different issue. That, that's another issue which we don't really have time to go into. But for this particular report, it's to do with operating. Now, efficient operating means high aircraft utilization hours, being able to come and go reasonably quickly, turn around within 25-30 minutes is what a lot of the airlines will be looking for. But we have a lot of downtime in Nigeria. We've got a lot of weather disruption. We've got airport readiness. We've got no slots. So you've got a congested airport at peak times, which means that puts pressure on the schedules, which means it affects the aircraft utilization, because some of the airports don't operate, late into the night. So you've got to try and get to those airports as quickly as possible. And so you've got a constant fight between, you haven't got a lot of aircraft, that's one thing. But if the airport and all the services provided also don't have capacity, you're being constrained, not just through, not even your own fault, but through external pressures as well. So we need to look at what is causing the grounding of aircraft. So it's because some of the commenters have been saying, oh, it's because the airlines don't have aircraft, they should just get more aircraft. But these aircraft are currently sitting on the ground. They have aircraft which they either can't send for maintenance, or they can't bring back for maintenance, or they are waiting apart, or whatever. So it's not a situation where they should just go to the market and buy another aircraft, or just go, online and rent another aircraft. It's not that. We need to look at the fundamentals of what is causing the airlines not to be able to maintain their existing fleet before we now bring in more fleet that then end up grounding like the last ones. Because the reason why we looked at this was we've had more airlines join the Nigerian aviation market, and therefore that should have meant an increase in aircraft. But the same thing has been happening to the airlines which have joined. So it's not a question of let's just keep adding more to the top of the funnel. If there is some sort of bigger hole opening, everything is just falling through. So we're not really getting that. So we need to do studies on the aircraft, the grounding. We need studies at the airport. We need to solve the weather disruption. We need to solve any downtime. We need to make sure that the airports all have runway lighting and navigation aids. And we need to be looking for growth, not for growth's sake, but we need to be getting more hours out of the existing aircraft before we start thinking about adding more infrastructure. We need better coordination with our existing infrastructure. That's what we need.
Thank you for that. Point well made. So it's not just about adding more aircraft. You touched on MROs briefly. I just wanted to jump into that a little more because we did have a report from this day newspaper that was looking at the cost of airlines sending their planes overseas. They estimated $2 billion. And of course, for our viewers, MRO, of course, is maintenance, repair, and overhaul. Well, so we've got about 4 of them that apparently exist here. We know Air Peace is working on another facility that hopefully will be ready in 2027. But I do also want to read you a quote from the managing director of Airlines Contractors, Captain Ado Sanusi, where he says the reason why airlines still take their aircraft overseas for maintenance is because the facilities in Nigeria are yet to have the capabilities, trained personnel, and tooling required to conduct major checks. Aero, he gives his airline, for example, is expanding its capacity, its facility. It has sent engineers overseas for training. So the major requirements is not just the facility, but the right personnel and tooling. Can you please share your thoughts on the MRO situation in Nigeria? Because there's been, every time a new one comes up, it's celebrated, and you think that would end having to send airlines overseas for maintenance.
No. MROs are a high capital intensive investment, a long-term investment. And the idea that Nigeria can have multiple MROs of tiny scale and then solve the problem of multiple aircraft types, models. It's fanciful. We need local MROs, but we need local MROs at scale. The capital investment of one sort of, single owner occupier isn't going to cut it. If you think about how much airlines have to invest in each aircraft, when you are an MRO, you need specific manuals for each of those aircraft models, the type of aircraft. You need certifications, you need engineers trained, you need, like all of the equipment is different for each of the aircraft. So if you are going to be operating an MRO in Nigeria, which is going to be OEM, like manufacturer, you've got a big expense. And so it's not going to be possible for 4 or 7 or even 20 small MROs to be able to do that, because each of them are going to have to buy all of that equipment and send all of their people for all of these overseas training. So what we need is a single big MRO, or maybe 2 MROs, so that MRO doesn't become a monopoly and start charging unreasonable prices. So if we had 2 MROs that were able to scale up with the right equipment, the right amount of capital, the right number of engineers, so that it could be operating on the aircraft which Nigerian Airlines, and not just the airlines, but the business and general aviation, also, because that's another spend which is going out. So the MROs wouldn't just attract customers from Nigeria, they could, like the other MROs, attract customers from outside of Nigeria as well, so that their pool of customers expands. That's the only way to make it financially viable for them to be able to equip themselves fully across the board with training and everything for it to make sense. So we really need to stop this clamour to spoil the system of MROs in the same way that we have too many airlines, and so it's difficult for airlines to scale.
Makes a lot of sense. Gosh, there's just so much to discuss in the aviation sector. It's voluminous. But I do want to get to this diagram in your report. It talks about this aviation loop. We're displaying it for the viewers here. In the center of the loop, operating below efficient scale, you've got an arrow going from effective capacity constraints to unit cost rising to fares increasing to demand softening, and around and around. So break it down for us. What's this loop?
Okay, so it's basically what we've seen is what we call the Nigerian aviation contraction loop. So if effective capacity, so if the serviceable aircraft, the aircraft that you can actually fly, contracts, that means is pulled out of service, seats are not available, that means that, as I said, your costs are now spread across fewer. It wouldn't happen just like on a day basis, but if that aircraft is out of service for a while, you've got to factor in the cost of your operations against your existing fleet. So that unit cost, the cost per seat, which is applied, there's a revenue per seat, but there's also a cost per seat. So that cost per seat is spread over fewer seats. It means that the fares increase, which we have seen, then, and that's because they're trying to recover their costs, not because they're trying to exploit anyone. So we're calling that defensive pricing. So in the past, a lot of airlines went out of business because they weren't brave enough to price their product at the price that they needed to charge in order to cover their bills and maintain their aircraft, etc. So this crop of resilient airline operators have done the hard thing, which is dug their heels in and stood by their pricing despite the Senate questioning, despite the public questioning them. But what has been missing is an education of the public as to why the price is what it is. And so as a result of price being high, not just because of the price of the fare, but it's to do with affordability. people's pockets can only go so far. Airlines costs, and sometimes the cost will increase, but even if costs stay the same but supply reduces, that increases the fare, because the same thing as I said, it's a loop. That same cost is spread over fewer seats. So it doesn't matter whether the costs are the same or the costs increase. But once demand kicks in, that reduces the demand, which means that you've got... If the supply, which is where the problem is, if the supply is reducing by more than demand has reduced, that's what happened in December, you still have high prices. So it's a continuous loop. So one thing influences the other and it influences the other.
Thank you for the illustration. Really appreciate that. Just it goes to show how much work needs to be done in the industry. Look, I think you already kind of answered this earlier when I asked you the fundamentals to scale. You said to focus on operational, but how do we break this loop? My final question to you: how do we break this loop?
Well, it's not, as I said, it won't be broken by tackling fare. So one of my colleagues did a fare study, and he's found, some interesting things to do with fare. I won't talk about that specifically, but just by reducing the fare, it's not going to change this, because the fare reducing even makes it worse. So it's because they have to cover their costs. And if they can't cover their costs, we just end up in a situation whereby we start losing airlines. Because, as I said, the cost is the biggest part of the airline, ticket. But it's not all of the costs are generated just because the airline wants to make money. They've got fees, they've got charges, they've got salaries, they've got fuel, they've got all of these operating costs and their fixed costs. They've also got the costs from delays, because delays cost money. They've got costs from delays, not just of flights, but every time a spare part needs to come into the country, we've got delays. We've got delays in terms of certifications. We've got delays when it comes to visa approvals for crew. We've got delays throughout the system. So the other way you can't resolve it is just by adding more aircraft, because the airlines already invested in aircraft. And so if you're just going to add more aircraft without fixing the underlying problems, all you're going to do, like we saw, because as we know, we've got more airlines now than we had previously, but still we've got a depletion of fleet of aircraft. What really that means is the attrition rate of the aircraft which is losing the service, not necessarily the sector, but service, is faster than the replacement. And so what we need to do is to do a study, find out exactly what is the problem with these aircraft. Why is it that these aircraft, if it's a global supply problem that there's nothing we can do, fair enough. But if it's down to system issues at our end, then we need to be able to do something about that. We also need to be able to make sure that the airlines are able to use the aircraft they currently have more efficiently. They need to have higher aircraft utilization. There needs to be faster turnaround. There needs to be penalties for anybody within the system who is causing delays. We need a campaign of keep Nigerian aircraft flying.
Yeah.
That's what we really need. We need everybody to have a single focus of how do we keep these airlines flying, how do we keep the aircraft in the air, because aircraft in the air are not generating revenue, and aircraft in the air is adding to the end user, which always is going to be the customer who's going to have to pay for the cost of inefficiency at the end of the day. But what I find is unfair. The only people who get blamed for the inefficiency is the system, is the airlines. But honestly, we need another program for me to talk to you about the inefficiency in the system.
We gotta have you back. Sindy Foster, Principal Managing Partner at Avaero Capital Partners. Thank you so much for a very insightful report and insightful breakdown from you. We appreciate your time. Thank you.